Hi everyone, Robert Skidelsky joined us today, a professor emeritus of political economy, an author, and also member of the House of Lords of the United Kingdom. How are you reading the tariffs of Trump? Is this the end of globalization, or is it simply a need for the United States to restructure some of its position in the international economy?
Well, globalization was coming to an end anyway. I mean, sanctions were a very important element in the breakup of globalization, or they accelerated it, because what it meant was that you were dividing the world into three groups: the sanctioners, the anti-sanctioners, and the people who are sort of in the middle. So in a way, it recreated you were beginning to recreate the threefold division of the Cold War between the NATO and the West, the communists, Soviet Union and China, and the non-aligned powers headed by India. This was the kind of Cold War, and this is what's happening now. In that period, you didn't have globalization. You had a Western trading bloc. You had a Soviet trading bloc, and then you had others who sort of, were in between and traded with both. Now, that I think is basically what the sanctions regime has recreated. And tariffs are sort of not quite completely consistent with it, but part of the process of no longer thinking of the world economy as a single entity which needs to be preserved. You've already accepted the idea that it's breaking up. And in this breakup, America or Trump wants to achieve the best deal for the United States. There's one other point I wanted to add about the breakup of globalization. I think it really started in the crisis of 2008, 2009. And before then, there was what I call the Fukuyama moment, when, everything was going to go wonderfully, end of history, Pax Americana. And then you got this terrific crisis. I mean, there was also earlier terrorism, but the financial crisis meant that the banking system, the idea that you could liberate financial flows globally, and that they were self-adjusting, that there were not going to be any financial crises in the course of doing that. That was exploded. You almost had another Great Depression in 2008, 2009. And after that, globalization was always, I think, about to come to an end. Anyway, it's been accelerated. Tariffs, tariffs, tariffs. I don't think I don't think it's a good method. I think America had a problem. It was running a permanent balance of a trade deficit. It had gone on ever since the 1970s, really. And that meant that the dollar was becoming increasingly overvalued. Americans were simply importing more than they were exporting. And that meant that a lot of American industry was being exported abroad, because their dollars were paying to set up offshore facilities. In that sense, Trump is right. I mean, you had a problem of the overvalued dollar and the hollowing out of American industry. And that was wrong, not just from the point of view of jobs that were being lost, but for security reasons. You don't want some of your best industrial plant to sort of be offshored to Southeast Asia. You want it at home. So there was a strategic reason, an economic reason. But the way he set about it wasn't right. I mean, one hopes that it's a bargaining. Mainly a bargaining posture. One hopes, and that he will do trade deals with the sort of the friendly countries, if you like, um, that will sort of restore some semblance of globalization in some part of the world anyway.
You refer to the Fukuyama moment, and I remember in those days, and also in the yeah throughout the 2000s as well, up to 2008, everyone spoke of the interdependence between the U.S. and China. But really within this interdependence, we saw that every year the Chinese lent more money to the Americans so they could buy more uh, yeah, Chinese goods. So year by year, you saw more and more productive power shifting to China
Yeah,
and more of the reserves of America moving across to China. And meanwhile, China was climbing up the global value chains with more
yeah.
and more technological development. So my thought at the time, around the 2006 at least, was this can't really be sustainable over time. And I think that's what happened after 2008-9. The Chinese became very uncomfortable with sitting on this much American money, which they might not actually get back. Meanwhile, the Americans were also dependent or getting more concerned about their excessive dependence on China. So suddenly they both became very aware that this wasn't sustainable. And I think that's when the Chinese began to pursue different economic and industrial policies, and the Americans also began to hedge a bit against the rise of China.
You had, you're absolutely right. I mean, that's all exactly as I interpret it as well. The first sort of real crisis for the dollar was in the late 60s. I mean, the dollar started as the mighty imperial currency after the Second World War. America was a huge surplus. It was a surplus nation. And and so the dollar was really scarce. And but then America sort of started providing services for the rest of the world, which meant that there was a drain of dollars to France, to Germany. For example, America mainly financed NATO. America started fighting wars, the Korean War in particular, and then it also brought up a lot of industry in Europe. So there was a drain of dollar in 1971. Nixon um, cut the link between the dollar and gold, which is why American currency was sort of such a safe haven, and the dollar depreciated. That was the first sort of readjustment, but the dollar still remained this imperial currency. It still did too many provided too many services for the world, as you say, as a safe haven. And in the 1990s, when you had the Far Eastern financial crisis, everyone was looking for safe havens. The reserve accumulation of China and Southeast Asia increased, and they wanted to hold it in dollars. And so the dollar was again overvalued. But the point is, Trump has never said, look, the problem is that the dollar is overvalued. Let's try and find some way of reducing the value of the dollar, as Nixon did. You could reduce the value of the dollar. I mean, you can just if you want to, stop the United States being safe haven, you just impose capital controls. You put obstacles in the way of exporting dollars from the United States, and if so, people won't buy your treasury bonds, and that means that the dollar, the American value of the dollar will go down. And that would have been a way of doing it. Or you could have, there are other schemes, they're rather technical and one don't want to go into them, but there are other ways. This way, what you do is you create huge likelihood of retaliation. Everyone puts up tariff. World trade declines. World demand for goods declines because you're putting barriers in the whole trade, and you have another Great Depression. I mean, it won't, I don't think that will happen because, as I said, I think mostly it's for bargaining purposes. But what it won't stop is the continued breakup of the global economy, because what you will have is trade with our friends and don't trade with China.
I think Trump looks towards the economic nationalists of the 19th century in America when the US couldn't compete against the mature industries of Britain, in which they used temporary subsidies and tariffs to build up an industrial strength. But I think the problem now is that all of these high tariffs on on the world that America doesn't have the industrial capacity to actually replace the imports. So it's
Yeah.
not sure. I'm not sure how. Again, if the economic nationalist logic is that you should protect the infant industries from the mature one. In other words, the high quality, low cost products against your own, which would be high cost, low quality, then it's very difficult to do this if you don't actually have the industries to
Yeah.
begin with. I mean, the Americans aren't going to start making jogging shoes tomorrow if they put high tariffs on some coming from Vietnam. So,
I know. I mean, there are two things. I mean, it's one thing to protect infant industries, another thing to say we're protecting vanished industries.
yeah.
But secondly, the replacement will take time. I mean, new industries will develop, or some existing industrial manufacturing industries in the States will expand, particularly maybe in the higher tech areas. But that'll take time. But the effect on demand will be immediate, and that will be the primary effect. So there's a sequencing problem as well as the ludicrousness of trying to protect vanished industries. Of course, you're absolutely right to remind us that the American tradition was highly protectionist. Going back to Alexander Hamilton's report on manufactures in 1812 or thereabouts, and there be wanting to protect the nascent infant American economy from British competition. It was exactly the same logic as of the German Zollverein, which also was designed to protect German manufacturers from overwhelming British comparative advantage. So that goes back, and that went on all through the 19th century. America was a high tariff economy. Um, Towards the end, there was some sign that they wanted to reduce tariffs, but America only became a free trade economy after the Second World War. And the last outburst of high tariffs in America was the Smoot-Hawley tariff of 1931. Was it 1930? I think it was 1930, which really created the tariff wars of the 1930s, which, in the opinion of some historians, led to the Second World War. Because there you had these economic blocks: the Japanese bloc, the American bloc, the British Empire bloc, and the German bloc. They were all sort of highly protected, and there was no free trade in sight. And what the Second World War did was to sweep away some of these other blocs, leaving the Anglo-American bloc. And they then decided they didn't want to fight any longer. And so you had the Bretton Woods Agreement, which was very crucial in setting up the beginnings of the reglobalization of the world economy. And but it didn't quite do the job. Again, there are reasons we could talk about why that was so, but it was the beginning. In other words, the point is, if you want a globalized economy, you have to have good institutions. You have to have good global institutions. It's not enough to say, well, the market will do everything, but the institutions behind the last wave of globalization were very weak. You had the WTO, you had the IMF, but the IMF was really truncated. You had a bit of WTO. Everything else was done, not WTO, sorry, World Bank, and everything else was supposed to be done by the market, which was designed to produce this wonderful harmony of all the parts of the world, and then you'll go off into utopia. But of course, that never happened. So central institutions are required for a global economy. For central institutions, you have to have America, China, Russia, Brazil, India. They've all got to agree on these rules, and there've got to be some central enforcement procedure.
What about the European Union? What is its role? Is it a protectionist bloc or is it an instrument towards globalization? Because You mentioned Alexander Hamilton's work, and of course, followed with Henry Clay, and this manifested itself in the American system. But in Europe, the efforts to deal with British, I guess, economic dominance was first Napoleon's continental system to, put a block on the British goods, and you mentioned the German sovereign. But this was to a large extent the Germans. They were able to industrialize under the continental
Yeah.
system. That's to some extent what they wanted to recreate. And now they say that the EU is to some extent, of course, don't want to exaggerate, but a continuation of the idea of the solar verein, if I'm pronouncing it correctly. So I'm just wondering, do you see the EU as a more of a protective bloc? Because now that Trump wants to, well, he kind of very open about his disdain, if you will, for the EU. He calls it, he said, with a bit vulgar language, it was set up to screw the United States, he said. So is it because it's a like a trading bloc, which creates unfavorable conditions for the United States, or do you see the EU as an instrument towards globalization?
I've never seen it as an instrument really for globalization. I think the the uh, um, European Union. I mean, what Trump has done is to confront the European Union with the question of whether it wants to become a state or not. I mean, these economic arrangements behind, first of all, the European Economic Community, it was called. Then it became the EU. And then they added to the trade barriers the single currency. But it never became a state. So it took the economic route to, so to speak, identity without taking the political route, or the political route was left way behind. And so that inevitably meant the protectionist aspect, the Zollverein aspect, came to the fore. And that's not compatible with globalization, which is essentially a free trade idea. I mean, like with capital, it's free to go wherever it wants. Goods are free to be exchanged anywhere. And of course, another element of a global world, which has never been really accepted properly, is that labor, workers are free to go wherever they want. Now, that's the ideal. European Union has never accepted the freedom of trade. I mean, it's always been surrounded by tariffs. I mean, that was part of its identity. And so, how does it respond to Trump? Only by putting up tariffs, more tariffs, sort of um, raising its own barriers to American goods. That's the only response it's got, because it can't really. I mean, what it could do is to say to the United States, maybe, well, look, let's have a free trade area between Europe and America. But that's not going to do that, because in order to do that, it's also got to be much more politically self-confident. So that's the way I look at it. Europe is a long way from becoming a state. In fact, the European Union now has, I don't know how many members. I mean, must be 30 or something. I don't know, something like that. But it's not near. It hasn't got nearly enough cohesion to have a state system, a centralized tax system, even a properly coherent monetary policy. So it's left somewhere out of the action that's going on.
Yeah. Well, that's what I thought. Sometimes the EU seems to be a bit too critical about American tariffs, given that they have had their own tariffs for quite some time. But it also seems as well, again, if states are created in wars, if you look at the 1870 Prussia-France war, in what created a unified German state, it seems the EU is seeing some opportunity in this war now against Russia in terms of centralizing bit power. I'm not sure if federalizing the EU would be one step too far, but they're certainly, uh, yeah, giving more economic competencies
Mm.
to to the European Union.
But in a way, it's terrifying that we should be even thinking about war and war preparations as a means of unifying Europe. I mean, the whole of Europe was set up as a major antidote to war. I mean, it was designed to overcome Franco-German rivalry, which had destroyed Europe as a a force in the world and brought untold damage and destruction. Now, um, to even talk about the idea, well, for the next step to happen towards political unification, we have to posit the possibility of a war with Russia. And to my mind, that's uh, deeply depressing and, yeah, very depressing thought. But you're right. It may be the way the narrative is going.
I remember in the 90s and 2000s, all the literature on the EU was this is a different kind of power, normative power, civilian power, moral power,
Soft
this
power,
soft power. Yeah, there
soft
was all the
power.
terms we had to learn. It seems now we're
Yeah.
talking about geopolitical EU, but why? But just yeah, because yeah, before run out of time, my last question was just how you see the future of the US dollar, though, because most people in academia know you as yeah, the expert on Keynes, writing yeah several books on Keynes, and of course he had his Bancor. But we also had after the Second World War discussions about the use of the IMF's special drawing rights, but we ended up
Mm.
with the dollar. But if the dollar now comes under great pressure because of the debt, the tariffs, the economic coercion against China, Russia, where do we go from here? Do we go to new central currencies or just back to national
Well,
currencies? How
I
do you see the
think
future?
no. I mean, I think the dollar will decline. It's got to. I mean, it can't continue being this kind of super reserve currency all on its own. So the alternatives are either diversification of reserves, which have been talked about. But for that, you need much greater convertibility of currencies than, for example, China allows. Or you have a supranational reserve currency, which is an IMF, which is the Bancor, Keynes' idea of the Bancor. The IMF creates currency, a reserve currency. Um, uh, and that then means that no other country is under pressure to accumulate reserves on its own, because there will always be enough reserves for any to deal with any business contingencies. So those are the two things. You have either the multiple reserve function. It's very interesting. In 1960, America dollar, I think 80% of the world's reserves were held in dollars. And by 2023, it had gone down, but only to just below 60%. So these other blocks hadn't really emerged as major reserve currencies. And the reason was that China, which could have done, um, the yuan isn't convertible, isn't properly convertible, and you don't want to put money into a place unless you're sure you can take it out when you want to. So those are the two options. I would favour, as I think very interesting that I think the Chinese did actually propose in 2008, 2009 to create a new IMF currency, something that went beyond SDRs and became a proper reserve currency. That was a proposal made by the governor of the Bank of China in 2009. America, of course, rejected it, wouldn't even talk about it. But here are ways forward.
We might be returning to that proposal then. Anyways, Lord Robert Skidelsky, already taken too much of your time, so thanks again.
No, it was a great pleasure to be on with you, and good luck with your channel and your efforts. I mean, they're very much needed.
Thanks again.